The bright overhead lights of the congressional hearing room reflected off polished wood and cold steel, casting sharp shadows across rows of tense faces. What was scheduled as an ordinary oversight meeting had transformed into one of the most unforgettable confrontations in recent memory. At the witness table sat Kash Patel, the newly appointed solicitor general, exuding quiet confidence. His reputation preceded him, a razor-sharp legal strategist known for his composure, intellect, and the kind of arrogance only the truly gifted could justify. The air hummed with tension as he adjusted his microphone, preparing for another round of questioning. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, only 6 months into her first congressional term, but already earning a reputation for her calm precision and meticulous preparation. She waited patiently as the chair recognized her to speak, flipping through a stack of annotated documents. Her opening tone was deliberate, balanced, professional. "Mr. Patel," she began, "I'd like to discuss your office's position in the Anderson County case, particularly your reading of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act." The question was sharp but respectful. Patel smiled faintly, a veteran before a rookie. "Congresswoman, the statute's text is perfectly clear," he replied smoothly. "There's no need to chase legislative intent when the words on the page say what they mean." Crockett leaned forward. "But the court has repeatedly referenced intent when interpreting—" "Let me stop you right there," Patel interrupted, his voice rising just enough to dominate the room. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, you're twisting the law to fit a political agenda. This kind of misrepresentation is exactly what undermines public trust in our justice system." He leaned back with a smirk, satisfied with the verbal blow. A few quiet gasps rippled through the chamber. Staffers behind the dais froze mid-motion, and even seasoned representatives shifted uneasily. Cameras caught every flicker of expression, but Crockett didn't flinch. She adjusted her glasses, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something in her tone that warned the tide was about to turn. "Mr. Patel," she said evenly, "since you've chosen to question my understanding of the law, let's review your own interpretation in context." She opened a folder and began pulling out case citations like a surgeon preparing her instruments. "You've claimed the Supreme Court consistently supports your narrow reading of Section 2. Yet in Thornburg versus Gingles, the court explicitly rejected the position you're advancing." She held up the opinion. Justice Brennan wrote, and I quote, "The Senate report accompanying the 1982 amendments to Section 2 explicitly repudiated the intent test." The silence deepened. Patel blinked but said nothing. Crockett continued, flipping to another document. "In League of United Latin American Citizens versus Perry, the court reaffirmed that discriminatory effects alone can establish a violation. And in Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee, while the court outlined new considerations, it did not reinstate an intent requirement. So your claim that intent is necessary? Well, the record says otherwise." The once assured Solicitor General shifted in his chair. Behind him, an aide hurriedly rifled through notes, whispering something Patel ignored. Crockett's tone remained steady, her movements deliberate. "Now, you said the text of the statute supports your interpretation. I have the full text right here." She held up a page. "Perhaps you could identify the specific wording that implies discriminatory intent is required." Patel's jaw tightened. "Congresswoman, I've argued before the Supreme Court 17 times, he replied, voice clipped. "I understand statutory interpretation." "So have I," Crockett said calmly. "And I've also spent 15 years litigating how those interpretations affect actual people." The blow landed quietly, but decisively. She gestured to a large display behind her. "Here's data from counties that implemented the very policies your office defends. After these ID requirements were enacted, voter participation among Black and Latino citizens dropped by an average of 8.3%. Among white voters, only 1.2%. These aren't hypotheticals, they're measurable impacts." "Correlation doesn't imply causation," Patel countered sharply. "Correct," Crockett agreed, "which is why our analysis controlled for income, education, transportation, and age. The disparity remains statistically significant. Would you like to review our methodology?" Patel's face flushed slightly. "I'm not here to debate statistics. My role is to discuss law. And isn't the application of that law to real-world outcomes exactly the point? She asked. That was the moment his confidence faltered. The hearing room, once filled with quiet chatter and shifting papers, was now utterly still. The insult Patel had hurled minutes earlier now hung in the air like a loaded weapon pointed at himself. Crockett adjusted her microphone. Mr. Patel, earlier you implied I should revisit my law school textbooks. For the record, I graduated with honors from the University of Houston Law Center, where I served as editor of the Law Review. Before entering Congress, I litigated voting rights cases for 15 years, including 2 before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. I've also published multiple peer-reviewed articles on Section 2 jurisprudence. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. So when I ask these questions, they aren't political talking points. They come from a deep understanding of how these laws operate on the ground. No one spoke. Even the chair leaned forward slightly, captivated. Crockett held up another brief. This is your office's amicus filing in the Anderson County case. On page 27 it states, statistical disparities in voter turnout without evidence of intentional discrimination cannot establish a Section 2 violation. That's your language. It directly contradicts Thornburg and the 1982 amendments, which clearly removed the intent requirement. She turned another page. Senator Bob Dole himself, hardly a liberal, made clear that the purpose of those amendments was to shift from intent to results. So again, how does your interpretation align with the law, precedent, and legislative history? Patel hesitated. His usual polished tone now sounded uncertain. Legal interpretation is complex. Reasonable minds can differ. Certainly, Crockett replied, but the Solicitor General's office has a duty to represent the law accurately, not selectively. She switched to another chart. In 6 counties implementing these restrictions, 27% of eligible black voters lacked the required ID compared to 8% of white voters. That's not conjecture. That's confirmed data. Patel tried to pivot. Your data is selective. Other factors could contribute to the disparity. Which factors specifically? Crockett asked immediately. We already controlled for the major ones. The room fell silent again. Cameras zoomed in on Patel's face as he searched for an answer. He took a sip of water instead. I'm not prepared to debate methodology, he said weakly. But you're prepared, Crockett replied softly, to dismiss statistical evidence as irrelevant to the law's application. Her tone wasn't angry. It was the quiet voice of someone who had just won. Patel tried to recover. Congresswoman, I simply believe— No, Crockett interrupted, still calm. You accused me of twisting the law. I've quoted case law, statute, and legislative record verbatim. Which of these sources have I misrepresented? Patel hesitated, eyes darting toward his notes. Perhaps twisting was too strong a word. He admitted finally. Thank you for that clarification, she said, her expression neutral. Now, on what legal basis does your office still argue intent is necessary under Section 2? Patel exhaled, realizing the inevitable. Under certain circumstances, yes. Discriminatory impact alone may establish a violation. Thank you, Crockett replied evenly. Because that statement directly contradicts your own brief. She held it up again. You wrote, and I quote, statistical disparities without evidence of intent cannot establish a violation. Would you like to correct that statement for the record? The chair raised his eyebrows, clearly impressed. The man once seen as Washington's most formidable litigator now struggled under the weight of his own contradictions. Patel attempted to explain. Court filings often simplify complex positions, so your brief simplifies to the point of misrepresentation? Crockett asked pointedly. Patel froze. That's not what I said. Then I'll ask plainly, Crockett continued.
Does your office believe discriminatory impact alone, without intent, can establish a Section 2 violation?
Yes or no. It was the moment of truth. Patel's silence stretched long enough to make the air vibrate. Then quietly he said, Yes, under certain circumstances. Then, Crockett replied, Your statement today contradicts your own written position. I find that deeply concerning for an office tasked with representing the United States before the Supreme Court. Patel's face betrayed both frustration and reluctant respect. I'll review our brief in light of this discussion, he said finally. I appreciate that, Crockett replied. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about politics. It's about whether Americans can vote without barriers that violate the equal protection our Constitution promises. The timer buzzed, ending her round of questioning. Yet the room stayed quiet. No side conversations, no shuffling papers. Just the unmistakable recognition that something extraordinary had occurred. The timer buzzed, but no one moved. Even the chair hesitated before speaking. "The Congresswoman's time has expired," he finally said, his voice softer than before. But the energy in the room didn't return to normal. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something rare, a hearing that had turned into a masterclass in calm precision and quiet accountability. Patel sat still, jaw clenched, his fingers interlaced tightly in front of him. His aides exchanged quick, anxious glances, unsure whether to pass him another note or pretend they weren't there. Across the dais, staffers were already whispering, typing, and sending messages, clips and quotes flying through phones faster than anyone could count. Crockett collected her papers slowly. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just stacked the documents neatly, adjusted her microphone back to its resting position, and leaned back in her chair. The silence spoke for itself. When the next representative began their questioning, the shift in tone was unmistakable. The once confident witnesses now treaded carefully, measuring each word as though walking a tightrope. No one interrupted, no one dismissed, and no one dared to challenge her composure again. By the time the hearing adjourned, the air in the chamber was electric. Some members approached Patel, offering polite handshakes, careful to mask their discomfort. Others made their way toward Crockett, not for photo ops, but out of genuine respect. One senior congresswoman from California leaned down and whispered, "You handled that beautifully." Crockett smiled faintly. "I wasn't trying to handle him," she replied quietly. "Just the truth." Outside, the marble corridors of the Capitol buzzed like a hive. Reporters waited at every corner, cameras ready, questions already written. The confrontation had already gone viral within the first 15 minutes. Snippets of Patel's interruption and Crockett's calm dismantling replayed endlessly across social media. "Congresswoman Crockett, do you think Patel should revise his legal brief?" a reporter shouted as she stepped into the hallway. "I think accuracy matters more than pride," she replied without stopping, "especially when it concerns the rights of millions of Americans." Another voice cut through the noise. "Do you believe his interpretation intentionally distorts the law?" Crockett paused. She looked directly into the camera lens and said, "I believe in giving people the opportunity to correct their mistakes, but I also believe the public deserves honesty from those who represent them." Then she walked away, her aides flanking her in silence. Within an hour, major networks ran headlines like, "Crockett challenges Solicitor General the calm facts," "Overrule political spin," "Tense exchange on voting rights leaves Congress in shock." Clips flooded every platform, from late-night commentary shows to legal analysis podcasts. But what captured public attention most wasn't her words. It was her tone. Calm, unflinching, surgical. Commentators debated her technique. Some called it a masterclass in professional restraint. Others compared it to watching a chess grandmaster dismantle an opponent one move at a time. But for Crockett, there was no celebration. That night in her office, she sat alone reviewing transcripts and preparing for the next session. Her desk was lined with highlighted case law, handwritten notes, and printouts of historical voting data. Her chief of staff knocked gently. "You made history today," he said, entering with 2 cups of coffee. Crockett smiled tiredly. "I just made a record," she corrected. "History will decide the rest." The next morning, Patel's office issued a statement. It was measured, diplomatic, and carefully worded. The Solicitor General's office reaffirms its commitment to accurately representing statutory law before the courts. We appreciate the opportunity for clarification raised during yesterday's hearing, but the tone was unmistakably defensive. Legal analysts noticed immediately. On a morning panel, a former appellate judge commented, "When a sitting member of Congress cites Thornburg versus Gingles and Lulac versus Perry from memory, and the Solicitor General can't respond with specificity, that's not just a political embarrassment. That's a professional one." Meanwhile, behind closed doors, pressure mounted. Several senators demanded an internal review of the Solicitor General's filings related to voting rights. Others quietly reached out to Crockett's team, asking for her research notes. But Crockett wasn't focused on fallout. Her attention remained fixed on what came next, drafting legislation to strengthen enforcement provisions under Section 2 and close the loopholes Patel had tried to exploit. When an aide asked if she planned to respond to the online praise, she simply said, "No, let the record speak." 2 weeks later, the Supreme Court issued a brief order in a related case. Without full argument, the court remanded it for reconsideration in light of new evidence presented to Congress. The news broke quietly at first, buried under headlines about foreign policy and economic reports. But among those who understood, the implications were seismic. Crockett received the alert on her phone late that night. She read the order twice, exhaled slowly, and whispered to herself, "It mattered." The next morning, she arrived early to her office. Her staff found her at her desk, reading through the court's language again. "Do you think Patel saw this coming?" one aide asked. "No," she replied softly, "but he'll understand it now." Weeks passed, but the confrontation remained a defining moment in Washington's collective memory. Political strategists dissected it. Law schools replayed it in seminars on constitutional interpretation. Even late-night hosts joked about it, one saying, "She didn't raise her voice once," but the silence after her question said everything. In one televised interview, Crockett was asked if she regretted confronting the Solicitor General so directly. She thought for a moment. "I don't think truth needs to shout," she said. "It just needs to stand." Her words spread online, quoted across countless timelines and editorial columns. Months later, Patel testified again, this time before the Senate Judiciary Committee. The tone was different. He was careful, precise, even deferential when citing precedents. When asked about the Voting Rights Act, he acknowledged, "The results test under Section 2 remains a critical component of our electoral framework." Crockett wasn't in the room, but she was watching the feed from her office. When he said those words, she allowed herself a quiet smile, not of victory, but of validation. That evening, as the Capitol's lights reflected across the Potomac, she met a small group of civil rights advocates in her office. They'd fought for decades to preserve the same protections she had defended that day in the hearing. An older attorney, his voice thick with emotion, said, "You reminded this country that facts still matter." Crockett nodded. "They always have," she said. "We just have to make sure they're heard." He smiled. "The way you said it in that room. I've never seen anyone stay that calm while dismantling an argument that dangerous." Crockett laughed softly. "I've learned something in courtrooms, and if the law's on your side, you don't need to raise your voice. You just need to raise the record." As weeks turned to months, her exchange with Patel became more than a viral clip. It became a symbol. For young lawyers studying constitutional law, it was a model of preparation meeting composure. For activists, it was proof that intellect could still triumph over bluster. And for Patel, it was a lesson in humility. Sources later revealed that he had ordered a full review of every voting rights brief his office filed. Some were revised quietly, others withdrawn entirely. Behind the scenes, he reached out privately to Crockett. His message was short but sincere. "You were right. The record needed correction. Thank you." Crockett never shared the message publicly. She didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. The day the revised briefs were filed, Crockett stood by the window of her office overlooking the Capitol dome. She thought about the path that had brought her there. The long hours as a civil rights lawyer, the cases lost and won, the families she'd represented who were told their votes didn't count. All of it had led to that one moment, moment when calm truth had spoken, louder than outrage. Her chief of staff knocked lightly on the door. "You've got media requests piling up," he said. Crockett turned from the window, smiling faintly. "Tell them I'm busy," she said. "There's more law to write," he nodded. "You know, people are calling that hearing one of the great moments in congressional oversight history." Crockett looked back at the skyline. "If it helped even one person understand why these laws matter," she said softly, "then it was worth it." Weeks later, during a panel at Howard University School of Law, a student asked her, "How did you stay so calm when he insulted you?" Crockett smiled. "When I was a young lawyer," she said, "a mentor told me something I never forgot. The louder they get, the closer you are to the truth." She paused. So when he raised his voice, I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. The room erupted in applause. By the end of the year, the Justice Department announced a new policy directive to ensure uniform interpretation of Section 2. It explicitly cited legislative intent, case law, and, quietly but unmistakably, congressional testimony from a 2025 oversight hearing. Though her name wasn't mentioned, everyone knew. Reporters called, networks asked for interviews, and law journals requested commentaries. But when a journalist finally caught up with her on the Capitol steps and asked how it felt to have changed national policy with one hearing, she just smiled. "I didn't change anything," she said. "The truth was always there. It just needed someone to read it out loud." She turned and walked up the marble steps, the echo of her heels mingling with the hum of a city that, for a brief, shining moment, had been silenced by simple, unwavering truth.